Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 399 of CryptoBiography, and it's part 4 of Cold Healing, and it's also the conclusion. And here we go. And so the town figured a necromancer lived nearby, but although I was never pegged as the one, I found myself separating myself more and more from everyone outside my family. They knew. My parents knew from that earlier moment. But although they never brought it up to me, I am certain my sisters both knew. As we grew into adulthood, my sisters both found boys they fell in and out of love with, and eventually my older, and then my younger, sister got married. Some part of me wouldn't have minded finding the right person to fall in love with, but every time I thought about it, it just didn't seem possible. Who would fall in love with a necromancer? Though I was alone, I wasn't lonely. I moved out of the family house and into a very small, decrepit cottage out of town, but not too far away from my parents. I could even visit my sisters when I could spare the time for the day to walk there and back. I fixed the cottage up as best I could. And because I was alone, I changed my habits somewhat. Now, when I raised an animal from the dead, if it was a kind I wanted near me, I didn't send it away. And so my cottage had a number of animals round it that, if you didn't look too closely, added a lovely touch. Some of my favorites were owls, which, despite their eyes turning gray, still had a sort of lovely charm. And I was careful to amend their instructions so that they wouldn't be seen in daylight by strangers. The years went on, and I decided to try to learn healing. Not magical healing. Once a magical gift is set, it doesn't change or expand, but just standard healing with poultices, various teas, and so on. My older sister, the actual healer, along with my mother, both also knew non-magical healing, which they used for minor ailments, as well as certain diseases and disorders which magical healing wasn't particularly suited for. I ended up becoming my sister's apprentice and assistant. To everyone else, I was just the non-magical helper, and that was fine with me. I got to be sociable, at least a little, and spend time with Siobhan. But then it happened. There were rumors that the capital was going to march out on our town for some imagined slight. The town prepared as best it could, but the capital's army was not going to be denied. They swept through the town, killing everyone in their way, my family included. They tried to use their healing and other magics to help stem the tide, but it did nothing. I was at my cottage far out in the woods when it happened. I heard the rumors, but when it happened, I was too far away to even know it was happening. But when the smoke rose and drifted my way, my suspicions were piqued. I carefully went back to the town and saw the bodies everywhere. The army was looting the town. As horrified as I was, I knew there was nothing at that moment that I could do, so I returned to my cottage and waited. That night, I decided to see if they'd cleared out. I reapproached the town. Fortunately, the skies were clear and a half-moon was rising as I approached. Otherwise, I might not have been able to get there without carrying a light, which would have been foolish. The army had left. But up the road back to the capital, there were campfires. They had finished their looting as the light had died away, gone a short way up the road, and encamped there, feeling quite safe, knowing that the small resistance they had met was wiped out. Or so they had thought. The tickle had started back in my cabin. That was more of a roaring fire, crackling just behind my ears. Still, I was careful. I started at the part of town furthest from the capital, figuring there was the least likely to be enemies still there. Remarkably, I found no survivors. I'd been expecting others, like me, creeping around, connecting to others, looking for food or what have you. I saw none of that. Only a few places had been burned. Most of them were the few public buildings. The majority of the buildings had been left roughly intact, but with every man, woman, and child slaughtered. I started to touch the corpses. The energy was thrumming through me like a taut string plucked by a dragon's claw. I reached down and touched a man's body. After just a moment, he jerked and stood up beside me. "Protect me," I thought at him. "Groan if you see anyone who is not me or a zombie." He seemed to understand. I hesitated at the next corpse because it was a young woman, just a little younger than I was. But the dark gift was hungry, and my vengeance was screaming. I touched her, and she rose. I gave her the same instructions, then went to the next one, and the next. I did not raise the young children, and when I finally found my family, I did not raise them. Everyone else, even old friends, I raised. Morning was coming upon me. I was tired, but my work had really just begun. I called them all with my thoughts, and they came, falling in behind me as I marched out of town and toward the dull glow that was the remaining few fires of the conquering army. In less than an hour, I was there, and none too soon, for the sun would be rising any moment, and that would likely mean the army rising. But as it was, they were asleep, drunk on stolen wine, feeling that no danger could touch them here, having wiped out anyone who could have possibly attacked them. Kill them, I told my army. Kill them all. I knew that my army, dull-witted and unarmed, would not have had a chance against an army armed, armored, and ready. But against a mob of drunk, sleeping, unarmored louts? My army lurched forward with a strange moan that made the tickle at the back of my neck throb. Perhaps they were guards, but if so, they were tired and possibly drunk, if not actually asleep. As soon as my army lurched into the camp, screams rose up. I could hear tearing and rending noises, scrambling of men being awoken with violence in their beds, bloody yells of pain and horror and fear, groans from my minions, and strange crunching noises that could be almost anything but signaled violence and destruction. My army swept through, and I followed, now raising the dead of the hated army to swell the ranks of my followers. And the necromantic magic thrummed through me, not just the back of my head or tickling my neck, but throughout my body, and I found I had no limit. If there was a body, I could raise it, though I had already done so hundreds of times tonight. I could raise them all, and I would finish the enemy. And I made it so. Not a single man made it back to the capital. And when I found the leader's tent, with him and a few of his fellow officers around him and a few well-trained and well-disciplined soldiers holding off my army, I appeared before them. My army was still swarming around, but I held them back temporarily. You have destroyed my town, my family, and my life. In exchange, I have destroyed your army. None will report back. I will raise you as my minions to serve me however I please, and your deaths will feed my army. They stared at me, gaping, really, as I raised my arms. I didn't need to, of course. My order went out with my thought. But I wanted them to know that I was the one in control. My army surged forward, and despite their weapons and their armor and their discipline, they were overrun by the corpses of their own troops who were clawing and grasping. Their weapons did damage, but my army didn't care about injuries. Only complete destruction could completely stop them. So though they stabbed with their spears and swung with their swords, clammy hands soon grasped their arms and shoulders and necks, and then there was the biting and the crushing and the suffocation under dozens of filthy and stinking bodies. I raised them all, of course. Not all were in great condition, but I pinned a note on the leaders and sent them back to the capital. I left the note vague, but I let them know that they had brought it upon themselves for what they had done. After 1 hour, I sent my body. After one hour, I sent my army after the leaders. I didn't know when they would reach the capital, only that when they did, they would find their generals shambling up to the city limits, a rotting zombie. And then, shortly after that, would come my horde. I did not know, did not care, if they could fend off my army, or if they would destroy it. I didn't want a permanent army. What would I do with it? But I would send the blade back at the ones who thrust it at me and did such damage. And then I had to remake my life. And that's the end of the story. I hope you've enjoyed it. It feels like we could, in fact, do like a part 2 at some point, but I'm not sure what that would be at this point. So if we do a sequel, it will have to be, after some thought, probably after, I've written other stories and stuff. So hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Blue Sky or Mastodon. I am no longer active on Twitter X. And thanks for listening. Words and Music copyright 2025, Brandon Starr, all rights reserved. Characters and events are fictional, fictionalized, or satirical.